Good afternoon. We are so glad you are all here. My name is Noni O'Brien Geistert. I'm co-chair of this event as well as a member of First Plymouth and an employee for 15 years, but I just retired in August. Yay. So if you have any questions about the church or anything, just look for me or look for anyone who has a pink. We're the planning committee. Just a few announcements before I turn you over to our co-chair. We ask that you do not go down to the lower level at all. We run the First Plymouth Learning Center, and our little kiddos are down there. And so if you could steer clear of that, we would appreciate it today and tomorrow. Then on Saturday, if you want to take a tour of the church, please do. Maps and schedules are in your folders. I hope everybody grabbed a white bag. That's a present from us to you. And please visit the display tables that are down the hall. There's 6 of them, and they have lots of wonderful information for you. And 2 sets of bathrooms on this floor, right here by the office and down towards Plymouth Hall. And then 1 upstairs. We're only using this level and the upstairs. And Archway. There's a table from Archway in there. Please visit them. They have been very generous contributors to this event with a very generous donation. So we appreciate their help with this. And I'm going to turn you over to my co-chair, Deborah Voss, and she's going to introduce our keynoters and our worship leader.
Yes, I am Deborah Voss. I'm from First Congregational Church in Boulder, and it's been a wonderful experience co-chairing with Noni, who's done the yeoman's amount of the work. I'd like to introduce you to our keynoters first. Jim Antel, are you stand up? Prior to his very recent retirement, the Reverend Jim Antel served as Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. He still leads us as a much-respected leader, climate activist, author, and public theologian. Antel's book, Climate Church, Climate World, was featured in the Chicago Tribune on Earth Day 2018 and in Christian Century magazine on Earth Day 2019. Antel received the 2019 Steward of Creation Award from the National Religious Coalition for Creation Care, joining several other well-known activists. Welcome, Jim. And Peter, are you here? Many of you know Peter already, but as the Executive Director of Eco-Justice Ministries since 2000, he has helped churches to apply their faith and ethics to this time of deep ecological crisis. Eco-Justice Ministries has brought this message to hundreds of congregations and thousands of church leaders in the Rocky Mountain region, nationally and internationally. Peter has been a speaker and workshop leader at religious conferences across the United States. He is widely known for his weekly email commentary, Eco-Justice Notes, which addresses current issues of environmental justice from a theological perspective. And we welcome back the Reverend Leanne Bryce, who is our worship leader this weekend. She has returned to Colorado after many years abroad. I say that in terms of the United States.
Texas is not another country.
You might not be able to convince all of us of that.
Duly noted.
The Reverend Leanne Bryce has served as lead minister of the First Congregational Church in Colorado Springs since August of 2022. 2022. I realized I dropped the 22. She came to ordained ministry as a second career, following stints in choral conducting and public administration. She attended the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado in 2002, earning her Master's of Divinity degree. A passionate advocate of justice for all God's children, the Reverend Leanne has devoted her life to the nurture of healthy, affirming communities. And we welcome you back, Leanne.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you.
And with that, I think we'll start worship.
Thank you, Deborah. I also want to acknowledge and thank on the organ bench over there, suddenly identified and looking dismayed, is David Acton. I have the great pleasure of getting to work with David every day at First Congregational in Colorado Springs, and it's wonderful to have you here, David. Thank you. It's good to see all of you. It's good to be here. And I wanted to just begin today with some statements of truth. As we arrived, there was the presence of our siblings bearing public witness to remind us that our family in the Rocky Mountain Conference is hurting. And did you know, by the way, that there have been 71 mass shootings in the United States? Justine is now over a year old. 500,000 deaths due to earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Our global family is hurting. The theme of climate justice for this event, Congregations Alive this year, is an acknowledgement that our Mother Earth, is hurting. None of these complex realms of pain have easy answers. And so we begin today just by being present to those realities, being present to struggle, and offering ourselves as vessels of healing. The day that Harvey Milk was assassinated, Holly Near wrote a song about finding hope in the midst of pain. So I'm going to teach that to you now. You'll find the words. There they are. Thank you, Brian. Brian is AV guy extraordinaire. If you know the song, sing along with me. I'll ask you to join me on the chorus. I'll offer one of the verses. And just join me as you're comfortable. I am open and I am willing. To be hopeless would be so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. Let's do the chorus again. I am open and I am willing. To be hopeless would be so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. There is hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic in the nation. There is wailing the whole world round. But I am open and I am willing. To be hopeless would be so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. One last time. I am open and I am willing to be hopeless. Would be so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. Just sing along with me as you find the melody and are comfortable. We are all the leaves of one tree. We are all the leaves of one tree. The time has come for us to live as one. We are all the leaves of one tree. We are all the waves of one sea. We are all the waves of one sea. The time has come for us to live as one. We are all the waves of one sea. We are all the stars of one sky. We are all the stars of one sky. The time has come for us to live as one. We are all the stars of one sky. I thank you, God, for this most amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of the skies, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. We are all the leaves of one tree. We are all the waves of one sea. The time has come for us to live as one. We are all the stars of one sky.
Earth is home to around 1 billion trees that belong to over 60,000 species, and they live on every continent but Antarctica. And while they may seem extremely vulnerable to environmental changes, seeing as they can't get up and leave when the climate no longer suits them, trees have actually been around for close to 400 million years. They've survived all 4 extinction events that they've been around for, and their ability to break down rocks, create soil, and siphon carbon dioxide from the air and replace it with oxygen is what made our planet habitable for humans. But however grateful foresters, poets, and lumberjacks might be for their presence, trees have always been a bit difficult to understand. When it comes to finding similarities between trees and animals, there's not a lot to work with. Trees are immobile, don't have blood or lymph or nervous systems, and only need sunlight and water to produce their own supply of food. They can live for thousands of years, growing slowly taller and wider. One Great Basin bristlecone pine is over 5,000 years old, and even in a forest, they seem like solitary individuals, competing for access to sunlight, but otherwise having no interactions with their neighbors. But as it turns out, there's more to trees than meets the eye. It was only a matter of looking deeper, down to the roots instead of up to the canopy. While we might only see and hear the birds and squirrels filling forests with noise, there's a vast network of communication happening right under our feet. Trees sharing resources, passing on warnings, and passing down information over the generations. A network of trees talking. It allows the forest to behave as if it's a single organism and makes scientists rethink the evolution of tree life. Is it based on competition or cooperation? And by understanding this network, we might be able to unlock secrets that will help in our fight against deforestation and climate change as a whole.
Hear this ancient lesson from Psalms 1 through 3. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on God's law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all they do, they prosper. And now, hear this modern lesson from Harmony by Colleen Lineberry. One morning, when I dig brown earth with bare fingers and listen to the light wind shuffle through oak and elm, I hear the silver of chimes dangling from a thin wire. The cadence of children laugh themselves dizzy like swirls of bubbles at play. A choir of robins trills gossip and questions, a thicket of poems in the understory. Each voice from each perch sings through a window of sky. I remember to remember how good this day is, to slow through creation along with the breeze as it gentles and praises the trees.
Thank you, Deborah. When I sat down to think about what the worship experiences for Congregations Alive might look like, the image of trees just jumped out for me. Trees, I thought, might be a more positive way to think about climate change. Trees do their part. As trees grow, they remove carbon dioxide from the air, store carbon, release oxygen. So trees are working right alongside those of us who seek to heal the earth ravaged by climate change. I am inspired by trees. I've always loved being around trees, being in the presence of trees. And since I'm someone who also draws inspiration from music, I started my worship prep by Googling songs about trees. It was a complete waste of time. Here's what turned up. Sing along if you know these songs. Lemon tree, very pretty, and the lemon flower is sweet, but the juice of the poor lemon is impossible to... I don't know what that means. Was not inspired by it. Here's one. Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. That's fun. Not a lot of depth. This was next. Oh, Christmas tree, how lovely are your branches. That's out because I truly dislike singing Christmas music when it's not Christmas time. And then perhaps my favorite, tie a yellow ribbon round the old oak tree. It's been 3 long years. Do you still want me? And I realized It's been 5 years since I've done worship at Congregations Alive, so I started singing, "It's been 5 long years, I hope they still want me." So it gave me a little laugh, but as I said, Googling songs about trees was zero help. But then I found something much more helpful. Joanna Macy's book called Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power. Have we ever needed unexpected resilience and creative power more? Macy writes, "A timber executive once remarked that when he looked at a tree, all he saw was a pile of money on a stump. Compare this with a Haudenosaunee view that trees should be treated with gratitude and respect. If we understand how essential trees are to our very breathing, we want to support them. A reciprocal, interdependent dynamic like that has the power to change us. It pulls us into a cycle of regeneration in which we take what we need to live and we naturally also give back. And because our industrialized culture has forgotten this principle of reciprocity, forests continue to shrink and deserts grow. Trees are magnificent, aren't they? Last month, my wife Lisa and I got to visit Hawaii. We went to Maui, where there's a historic town named Lahaina. Raise your hand if you happen to have been there. It's a popular tourist destination, yes. Lahaina, in the days of native rule in Hawaii, Lahaina was the royal capital, dating back to the 1820s. And right in the middle of town, in Lahaina, is the court square, and there's this giant banyan tree overlooking the harbor. Isn't it nice how I made you watch our vacation pictures? Yes. Very clever of me. This tree was planted in 1873 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the arrival of Christian missionaries in Hawaii. Christian missionaries, not always helpful. What can I say? Ours is a complicated legacy. Banyan trees are unique in that the branches shoot out in all directions, and then every 30 feet or so, the branches dive back into the earth and provide this additional support to this great spreading tree. This tree is about 150 years old, which is not that old, at least as some trees go. This is the General Sherman tree. By volume, it is the largest known single-stem tree in the world, and it lives in Sequoia National Park in California. It's estimated to be around 2,500 years old, which means it was around when Jesus walked the earth. The oldest tree in the world, until 2013 that is, the oldest individual tree in the world has a name. It's called Methuselah. It's 4,875 years old, a Great Basin bristlecone in the White Mountains of California. It did not give up its status as the oldest tree in 2013 because it died, but because an even older tree was discovered then. Another bristlecone pine in the same region, this one over 5,000 years old. Trees inspire us with their magnificent form, their beautiful foliage, longevity, their sense of history. Trees take the long view. If trees could talk, they would tell stories of joys and sorrows, of loss and gain, celebrations and consternations, hard times and good times. And they would tell us that all of these things come and go. No one experience of reality is eternal. Nothing lasts forever. Even your ringtone, when it goes off unexpectedly, it's all right. The universe is always in flux. The healing property of trees is the inspiration for a practice called forest bathing. Shinrin-yoku is the name for the practice, which arose in Japan a few decades ago. Shinrin meaning forest, yoku meaning bath. And forest bathing is based on a very simple premise. We all know how good it feels to be among trees. We have always known the sounds of the forest, the scent of the trees, the sunlight playing through the leaves, the fresh, clean air. These things give us a sense of comfort and grounding. They ease our stress. They help us to relax and to think more clearly. Being around trees can restore our mood, give us back our energy and vitality, refresh us, and rejuvenate us. Hopefully these pictures of beautiful trees evoke a sense of the forest. I wish we could be instantly transported there so that we could gain strength and centeredness from our tree friends. But since we can't, we're going to do the next best thing. I've asked my partner, Lisa November, to lead us in a guided meditation. Lisa is ordained in the Order of Inner Being under the lineage of Thich Nhat Hanh. And I invite you forward.
Thank you. As Leanne was saying, mindfulness is all around us, in nature especially. The Buddha taught, and my teacher Thich Nhat Hanh also taught, that everything has Buddha nature. It has sort of a life of cosmic energy. So, of course, all of us humans do, but this bell also has Buddha nature. So, in the same way, we wouldn't go up to a friend when we just met them and hit them with one of these. We're not going to hit or strike the bell. We're going to invite the bell first. And we invite the bell just with a gentle, muffled tap. And as we sound the bell for 2 sounds, I invite you just to find your posture, relax. You can close your eyes or just have them at a 45-degree angle to the ground and breathe with the Buddha nature of this beautiful bell. And let the image or the feeling of a tree come into your mind. This tree that should have strong roots deep in the earth that lead up to the trunk. And then the trunk of the tree that leads out into branches. The branches covered with beautiful leaves. And when you have this tree in mind, get in touch with the whole tree. From the tips of the leaves, on the tallest branches, down to the deepest roots in the earth. Let's start with the roots, imagining the roots going down into the earth, forming intricate patterns in the soil, almost mirroring the branches that reach and form patterns against the sky. These roots, the tree of mindfulness, are like breath. So right now, you can breathe deeply into your roots. See and get a feel for them as they expand as you breathe in and release as you breathe out. Breathing in, I know this is an in-breath, and breathing out, I know this is an out-breath. Anytime we come back to our breath, we come back to our roots and we strengthen the energy of mindfulness in all of us. These are the roots of enlightenment. We know we are breathing and we feel alive. To be alive is something wonderful. Breathe deeply into your roots once more, because this is how we get to know our breath, how we take care of our breath, simply by enjoying our breath. Now see that the trunk of your tree as being an extension of the roots. Of course, the roots lie below the ground, so they may not be seen by everyone, but the trunk is visible above ground. Let your mindful roots expand up into the trunk of your tree. And branches of mindfulness extend out from this trunk. Maybe you can imagine the trunk as your own belly. Breathe deep into your trunk and let all the breath out through the branches and leaves into the world. Breathing in and out, I can follow my breath from beginning to end. This is a grounding practice. We feel ourselves planted right here in our earth. And you can let an emotion come up in your mind. It might be a strong response like grief or despair when you think about climate change. The strong feeling can be like a storm, making the high branches of your tree swaying back and forth in the wind. The tops of the branches and leaves being buffeted about by strong winds. But we know that our trunk, the belly, feels stable and safe. And breathing into the trunk of this tree again, we realize we can stay stable and solid while the storm blows past us. Breathing in, I recognize strong feeling. Breathing out, I can calm this strong feeling. And as the storm passes, imagine the stable trunk of your tree smiling up to the branches and leaves. In much the same way that your own inner trunk smiles to your mind as it runs with thoughts and imaginings. And if you can, stay with that breathing in and out, deep in your belly, staying with the trunk of your tree. Storms of emotions will come and go, but we can breathe in and out. Belly rising, belly falling. We stay with this breath in a place of safety, knowing that all storms are impermanent. Breathing in, I know I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know I am breathing out. My in-breath grows deeper. My out-breath grows calm. Breathing in, I feel calm, my stable trunk. And breathing out, I relax and feel at ease. Breathing in, I can recognize and smile to strong emotions. Breathing out, I can release strong emotions. As we breathe with the bell.
Breathing in, breathing out. Join me as you're comfortable. Breathing in, breathing out. I am blooming as a flower. I am fresh as the dew. I am solid as a mountain. I am firm as the earth. I am free. Let's do that verse again. Breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. I am blooming as a flower. I am fresh as the dew. I am solid as a mountain. I am firm as the earth. I am free. Breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. I am water reflecting what is real, what is true. And I feel there is space deep inside of me. I As we move forward into this conference, let's learn to think like a tree. Soak up the sun, affirm life's magic. Be graceful in the wind, stand tall after a storm. Feel refreshed after it rains. Grow strong without notice. Be prepared for each season. Provide shelter to strangers. Hang tough through a cold spell. Emerge renewed at the first signs of spring. Stay deeply rooted while reaching for the sky. Be still long enough to hear your own leaves rustling. Amen.
You can go first. Jim and I have obviously scripted this out very carefully, and we're trying to figure out who's going first. I'm going to let Jim go first. This is the thing in the program noted as Meet the Keynoters, and we'll see if we give you too much information.
It's always funny, the question of applause in church. Can we have applause for that wonderful worship service? I had the opportunity to meet Thich Nhat Hanh in my previous incarnation as head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation for this country. And it was one of the great honors of my life. And I just so appreciated that part of the worship as well as all parts of the worship. So let me say a few things about myself. I guess is that what we're supposed to do, Peter? Okay. So I currently serve our denomination, the United Church of Christ, as the special advisor on climate justice to the general minister and president, who currently is John Dorhauer, but as many of you may be aware, we are going to have a new general minister and president come this next and upcoming synod. I've preached on climate change since 1988, I think in about 400 or more settings. From 2006 to 2018, I was the conference minister for the Massachusetts Conference, now the historic Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ. And I was actually the initiator and, to some extent, the designer of what has become the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. Before that, I served 2 congregations for 10 years each, one in Shaker Heights, Ohio, also called Plymouth Church, and one in Newton, Massachusetts, the Newton Highlands Congregational Church, where I had half the faculty of Andover Newton Theological School. Yes, I appreciate the laughter, indeed. Peter and I had dinner the other night, and we had some laughs over that, as he and I are both graduates of Andover Newton, and I also attended Yale Divinity School and Princeton University as an undergraduate. Let me say a bit about my origin story as a lover of the earth. I came from a disturbed family. My mother was schizophrenic and alcoholic. And I had to switch custody when I was 15 to my father, which in 1965 was unheard of. It was actually a legal precedent in New Jersey. And I went and joined him in California. And in order to get to know one another, because we hadn't seen each other for 3 years, we did a tour of the national parks. And I fell in love with the national parks. So the next summer, in '66, I hiked the John Muir Trail and did it again in the summer of '67. And then as an undergrad, the first Earth Day showed itself in 1970, and I was one of the organizers on my campus of that. When I was in graduate school, my work in graduate school in the ethics department focused on the question, how is it that God gave us such freedom that we have the capacity to destroy God's creation? I also, not surprisingly with that topic, focused on disarmament and nuclear weapons and taught courses on the history and ethics of nuclear weapons. And then in the late 70s, thanks to Carl Sagan and some writing that he did, I began to focus on climate. I wrote and was the primary champion, I guess, of 3 groundbreaking synod resolutions. The first was in 2013, when our denomination became the first national body and the first religious body to vote to divest from fossil fuels. And we'll have some conversation about that in workshops and other places. In 2017, the National UCC Synod voted to declare a new moral era in opposition to President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. And in 2019, the UCC National Synod became the first Christian denomination to endorse the Green New Deal. I'm wonky enough that it was actually fun to write those resolutions. If any of you have attempted to write a synod resolution or even a local church resolution, you know it's the most distant thing you can imagine from fun. I've engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience well over a dozen occasions. I've kind of lost count on that, and be happy to talk about that some at different settings that we have here. And as was mentioned earlier, in 2018, I published a book called Climate Church, Climate World. And over the course of the past 4 years, it became the publisher's bestseller, so that a new revised edition of that, an updated edition, is coming out. The new chapter, I'll let you know, is the title of the new chapter is Trump, Biden, and Greta. Years of upheaval, 2018 to 2022. And in what I have to say tomorrow in my keynote, you'll hear a little bit about that. So what's my message going to be to you? I guess we're supposed to give a little summary of what our message is going to be. So here it is in a nutshell. But if you get up and leave after this, I'll be completely offended. First, God is calling our generation to engage the greatest moral challenge humanity has ever faced. Our generation must write a new story, rooted in our interdependence with God's creation. To do that, we must cross the abyss between our current story and the story God is calling us to champion. That requires us to face our current crisis and engage our moral imagination so that we can envision and then incarnate a fossil fuel-free future. Who will lead this effort? The scientists have already done their part by giving us all the solutions we need to accomplish this transition. Young people are already leading. Don't look to corporations. Their only interest is in maximizing quarterly shareholder profits and extending their ability to profit from running Genesis backwards as far as possible. I will detail their decades of deception in my talks. As for politicians, too many are compromised by their donors' demand for power and profit. It's high time that people of faith recognize and accept the crucial role we must play in providing vision and leadership as humanity transitions to a more earth-honoring way of life. I believe that God is calling our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. Churches committed to working on the climate crisis recognize that we are most free when we embrace our interdependence, that we are most fulfilled when we are grateful for having enough, that God's call, our vocation, is to recognize that we are all in this together, and that God is offering us not personal salvation, but collective salvation. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Peter.
Well, Jim, you have me beat. I've only headed up the writing of 2 Synod resolutions in 1999 and 2003, which looked at the institutional structure of the denomination and why on earth we were a denomination that was incapable of talking about climate change. So what we started, and much of it came out of this particular congregation in 1999, starting that question of what's wrong with our church. It was about a 10 or 12-year process before it came to fruit, and now the UCC is the ecumenical leader in the United States in talking about climate change. So Synod resolutions do make a difference. The bio that was read to you earlier is a bit out of date. 2.5 years ago, I retired from my work with Eco Justice Ministries. Yeah. And stopped the weekly discipline of writing Eco Justice notes, which in some ways I miss, and in other ways is one of the great joys of my life. As you listen to what I'm going to be saying over the next several days, it will probably make far more sense if I tell you a little bit about my 3 conversion experiences, because they shape everything that is going to be coming up this weekend. A conversion experience is not a rational little thought that gets planted in your head. It's something that changes your sense of who you are and how you live your life, and often the sort of communities that you engage with. My first conversion, and none of my conversion experiences are churchy, so you're safe. The first conversion experience was a gradual one. I was a student at Colorado College down in Colorado Springs from 1970 to 1974, just after the first Earth Day. And my major in college combined environmental biology and religious studies. Who would have known where that would go? And Colorado College was just then starting into the block plan, where students take one course at a time very intensely, get 3.5 days to recover, and launch into the next course, which was murderous for organic chemistry and absolutely delightful for field studies and environmental biology. So we traveled all over the Southwest and up and down the Front Range studying biology, and the notion of ecology got into my bones. And I have never been able to look at the world since then without a sense of interrelated systems. You will be hearing a lot about ecology these days. The second conversion experience came just a few years later when I was in seminary at Endeavor Newton in the Boston area. And Boston was in turmoil at that time about forced school busing for integration in the schools. And the questions of institutional racism were hot, hot topics. And there was a marvelous, marvelous man, Horace Selden, who was an adjunct faculty member at Endeavor Newton, who taught us about, a friend of Horace there, taught us about institutional racism. And I had a profound and somewhat sudden conversion experience as I came to grips with the fact that I am enmeshed in an oppressive system, that I participate in that, and I am a white racist. I have never been able to look at the world the same way since Horace opened me to that sort of awareness. That summer, to become a whole earth church, some of you understand the history of that. And as I looked at that resolution as an environmental biology major, I said, well, that's sort of a wishy-washy resolution. Glad I didn't write that one. And so we took a family vacation down to visit my parents in Santa Fe, and I took along a stack of books, and I said, I'm going to read up on what's really going on in the world of environmental science these days. And I read through 3 or 4 books. And the stuff that I knew in my head moved into my heart that week. The reality of climate change crashed down on me. And I got really, really depressed. We came home from Santa Fe, and I was to be the guest preacher at my home church, and that is still a sermon that's memorable to some folk, because I let them have it. But I had this knowledge, I had this awareness, and I knew that I had to do something with that, because if I just sat there, it would destroy me. And so I started probing into ways I could connect with groups and do volunteer things. I engaged with the Colorado Council of Churches. I connected with the National UCC, was appointed the volunteer role of Eco-Justice Coordinator for the Rocky Mountain Conference, which didn't mean much of anything. And after a couple of years of doing those things, I realized that in part-time volunteer things like that, I would just about have enough time to maintain the mailing list and not do anything important. So at the end of 1999, I quit my work doing computer programming stuff at that point and began the process of starting Eco-Justice Ministries to work with the churches that I knew and to see how the church could be an active force for change. As I mentioned, I went to seminary. Yes, I am an ordained UCC minister. Allison and I did co-pastorate ministry in a couple of congregations in Iowa for 10 years. Came to Denver so I could do studies in religion and social change at ILF and Denver University, where I finished the coursework and said thanks and walked away from the program. But that also was great preparation for my time with Eco-Justice Ministries. As you will hear tomorrow, one of the phrases or questions that I kept asking myself through 20 years of working with Eco-Justice Ministries is, what does it mean to be the church in a time of great environmental and social justice crises? Not what can the church do, or what legislation should we endorse, or what sort of light bulbs should we use, but what does it mean to be the church? And I hope in my weekly Eco-Justice Notes, I often probed into the theological and the pastoral and the liturgical senses of being the church in a way that would be faithful and relevant. How can we be faithful, relevant, and effective was another set of questions. And so that's the background that I bring to this. Tuesday evening, Jim and I were rediscovering an astounding number of overlaps in our geekiness and strange academic connections and whatnot. Jim led a session down at Ghost Ranch 2.5 years ago that was absolutely delightful and life-giving for me. The trial of the century, as humanity was put on trial. What was the exact question on that, Jim?
Well, we did a mock trial of humanity, and the idea was that the participants in the seminar, there were like 20 of us, I think, altogether, they played different roles. So one of the roles was as people offering testimony, and then I assigned them like, the moose who was in the process of dying from being, accosted by ticks. And, the bristlecone pine that had lived for 5,000 years and was now being pushed over the edge from climate change, and so forth. But then they also had to sit as jury. And the title of it was The Prodigal Species, which is us, yeah.
The verdicts were harsh. Some were tempered with some mercy, but humanity was convicted by the jury. I represented coral reefs as the piece of evidence. Jim brings that sort of creativity to how we might think through these issues. Preparing our testimony made us dig deep into the evidence, and hearing those stories from many people was very moving. And thank you for that. Great to have such a great colleague in the cause. That's sort of my background. That's what I bring to it. I will very much be focusing on that question of what does it mean to be the church? As Jim and I were talking last fall about how to divvy things up, he said, well, I trust you to do the theology part. Sort of, it's not going to be heavy-handed. I will not be quoting all the great name theologians, so rest assured. And there will not be a test on it afterwards. This Congregations Alive on this theme was born just about 4 years ago. The last Congregations Alive had several workshops dealing with climate and environmental issues, which were very warmly received. And the sense after that Congregations Alive was the next one needs to focus entirely on this. And I was tapped back then when I was still working with Eco-Justice Ministries to be one of the speakers, and was delighted to recommend Jim as the other person that we needed to have here. And so, it's been an interesting and long 4 years waiting until we could gather again and do this work. Last May, our committee met and started to pull together what we thought would be the details, and the logo that's on your packet and the tote bag and whatnot was designed back in May and has things like ecology and migration and sustainability and church calling, which all make good sense for our theme. And then there's this 5 R's that seemed like a good idea last May and is not going to be a part of our topic. Yeah, covered some, yeah. The 3 R's, basic environmental thing, anybody name those? reduce, reuse, recycle. And the Whole Earth group here at First Plymouth latched onto something I taught years ago, saying we need to expand those, and people have done that in various ways. But one of the versions starts with refuse. Just don't go there at all. Don't be a consumer in today's world. And then often the fifth R, refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, restore. Let's go to the positive things. So now when you look at that logo, you'll at least have some idea what we meant with the 5 R's. Other announcement thing, Jim suggested that he has found valuable in conferences like this to have a clergy-only conversation, because the clergy might say things among their colleagues that they would not say among their parishioners. So there will be that clergy dinner tonight. Some of you who are clergy have signed up for that. And we will be down the hall in the Commons room after the last workshop session. So it's not on your schedule, but it will be happening if you are in the select group of those who have been ordained. And I think that covers the things that I wanted to say in terms of a Meet the Keynote. This session in our original schedule, Meet the Keynoters, was like an hour and a quarter. And I knew that I wasn't that interesting to meet. Jim is interesting, but that's way too much time to meet the keynoters. And so I suggested we needed to meet the crisis before we delve into too much conversation on the details. So we are delighted this afternoon to have a real live climate scientist with us for the next 45 minutes or so. Dr. Christopher Rosoff is a scientist at the University Center for Atmospheric Research, UCAR, in Boulder, a close kindred of NCAR. And we will now get a sense of what is actually going on in this world of climate change. And I think, Chris, thank you very much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you. It's a very great honor and privilege to be here. I work at NCAR in Boulder, and my main focus area is weather, and mostly severe weather, extreme weather, but I do have enough about background in climate to talk today. It's kind of a heavy subject, but I'm glad we have this whole weekend to be spiritually restorative and so forth. Yeah, that was also very important. I'm very honored to be a first Cong member in Boulder. And it's a church I feel very at home with, the Congregational church in general. It's a very progressive, good church. So we'll start out with the first slide. Next slide. This next slide, well, I was going to talk about the Marshall Fire here. Unfortunately, this topic hits close to home. So today's kind of ironic because we set an all-time record, or not an all-time, but a record low of -11 this morning, breaking our record of -7. But overall, if you take a look at the weather in the area, we've noticed some really extreme things in the past few years. Marshall Fire on that first slide was an example that hit home, close to home. Someone in First Cong lost their home, and also at least one of my coworkers lost their home as well. So it definitely brings meaning to our work when we experience firsthand the extremes of climate change and weather. So the next slide is not lakes, but actually perimeters of wildfires. And so one example of how we see here in Colorado things changing has been with an increase in fires. And prior to 2020, we had noticed that the fires were getting more frequent and larger. And part of that's due to the multi-year drought, also increased human activity. But there's definitely stresses going on in our local ecosystems. And then 2020 came along, and it was a very difficult year for all of us because so much forest burned. The 3 large perimeters there are just from that year alone. Largest wildfires ever recorded in Colorado history. I still haven't gone up to Cameron Pass, which is an area I spent a lot of time in college in Colorado State. And it's just been too difficult to go back there to see the damage. All right, next slide. So another way we've noticed change in the local areas through extremes, particularly in the summer. You've probably noticed if you've lived here a long time that we're getting a lot more 90 and 100-degree days. And in fact, that bears out in the data. This is data from Denver showing that the number of 95-degree days or warmer has really increased over time. You can see 2012 and 2020 spiking there. Those were 2 big wildfire years. All right, next slide. So just looking at Colorado temperatures, I apologize for the small font, but what we've seen since 1900 is that the temperature statewide has increased by about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire 4 seasons. So not only the summertime. And then what we see on the right is 2 different scenarios. The red is a business as usual scenario. If we were to continue to increase burning fossil fuels at the rate we are versus meeting some more of these targets that the IPCC of the UN has set is in the green. So we're pretty much guaranteed subwarming. It's the question of how much, and it's up to us to determine where we go in that curve. So it's wonderful that churches are getting involved like this to work towards that. All right, next slide. This slide is maybe not too convincing, but it's very important. This is the snow water equivalent, so liquid equivalent of all the snow on April 1st. And this record goes back to the late 30s. And what we see is that there's a lot of variability from year to year. But overall, there is a decrease. And the other part that's not shown in this figure is that the melt-off is occurring faster and faster each spring. Okay, so that's just to introduce you to what's going on in Colorado. So I wanted to do a bit of a scientific overview just to get us all up to speed. And please stop me at any time if you have any questions. So next slide. So first I'll start talking about radiation theory, and I apologize for the meme. I wanted to appeal to the millennials. Gen Z is probably rolling their eyes at me. Instead of going into equations, which radiation theory deserves, we'll use emojis. So this is the sun, which burns hydrogen into helium. So it's a huge mass, and it's collapsing in upon itself to the point that it creates fusion, hydrogen fusion into helium. And that allows it from collapsing completely into a black hole, these nuclear explosions that are going on all the time. And so that creates very hot temperatures, and at the surface we have temperatures almost 6,000 degrees Kelvin, which is 9,940 Fahrenheit. And so this gives off radiation in a whole bunch of wavelengths. If any of you have taken physics, it's Planck's radiation theory. And that gives off mostly in the visible, that's why it's very bright, but also all the other wavelengths, UV especially. And that comes towards us at the Earth. Some of that energy is reflected off the planet, but a lot of it is absorbed. And what happens is if this energy kept getting absorbed, the Earth would burn up and we'd get really hot. That's supposed to be an equals sign. But thankfully, that doesn't happen, that we emit energy ourselves. And because our Earth's temperature, well, so basically, if you set those 2 things equal to each other, we find out the equilibrium temperature of the Earth should be -1 degrees Fahrenheit. That would not support life. So something else is going on to allow it to be warm enough for us to survive here. And that mystery is the greenhouse effect. So thankfully, we have an atmosphere with greenhouse gases naturally present that keeps us from freezing. Okay, next slide. So if we look at different planets across the solar system, it's interesting to determine what are the equilibrium temperatures if there were no atmosphere versus what the actual temperature is. And so for the planet Earth, we have an equilibrium temperature below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And we actually have a mean temperature of 59 degrees Fahrenheit. If you go to Mars, it has a very thin atmosphere. It actually has a very small greenhouse effect because the atmosphere is composed of a lot of CO2. So it's about 6 degrees warmer than we expect. But Venus is crazy. That planet is a very bright planet because it has a lot of these bright sulfuric clouds that reflect a lot of the sunlight. So actually, the equilibrium temperature would be colder than the Earth, even though it's closer to the sun. But the actual surface temperature on Venus is 735 Kelvin, so extremely hot. And if we look at the atmosphere, it's actually a very dense atmosphere and composed of 97% carbon dioxide. So that's an example of an extreme greenhouse. I don't think, even if we burned all our fossil fuels, we need to worry about becoming Venus, but still, we don't want to go any further than we already have. All right, next slide. So talking about the radiation, so the electromagnetic radiation spectrum goes from wavelengths down to the radio wavelengths, which we can use to understand the universe. Microwaves, the infrared, which is what the energy the Earth emits. And then we have the visible light spectrum, which is just a small segment of the whole spectrum. That's what the sun emits and allows us, that's what we see. And then we have UV, X-rays, and gamma rays. So the sun is mostly visible light with a bunch of UV light given off as well, as we know from our summers here in Colorado. All right, next slide. So it turns out every single atom and molecule, and we know this from quantum mechanics and spectroscopy, that if we send a certain wavelength of electromagnetic radiation at it, it will activate that atom or molecule into an excited state. So, for example, the particles in the atmosphere are mostly oxygen and nitrogen, and those would react at certain wavelengths that are very short. But there are other molecules in the atmosphere that are only trace gases, and CO2 is an example of that. It's activated because it's a larger molecule by infrared radiation, which is the wavelength of energy the Earth is giving off. And so there's a various set of wavelengths that it reacts at that causes that molecule to get excited and start vibrating or rotating and so forth. And so that's what this graph shows, is a few wavelengths at where that molecule becomes excited. And when the molecule becomes excited, it can give off radiation itself. So if we take UV radiation coming up from the planet, trying to escape out to space, hits one of these molecules, excites it, and then it gives off heat and it gives off infrared radiation in all different directions, back towards the Earth as well. All right, next slide. So we actually have a few molecules in the atmosphere that are greenhouse gases. So we have carbon dioxide. Water vapor is a very active one. So if you're in the desert Southwest, in the summer it's very hot, but at night it gets very cool. You go down to Florida, it's also hot there, but at night it doesn't get very cool, and that's because there's a ton of water vapor in the atmosphere. And so that's the greenhouse effect, keeping you warm at night. And then there's a few other greenhouse gases that are natural, like methane. And then there's a few that are man-made that are up there now. So the big problem is we have an equilibrium on the planet where the greenhouse gases are beneficial. The problem is increasing them too high, and where they end up doing too much of a good job of keeping us warm. All right, so next slide. So I apologize for this busy slide, but what this shows on the top panel is 2 expected spectrums of radiation for both the sun on the left and then the Earth's radiation on the right. So the radiation on the right are following those little lines. What actually is measured at the top of the atmosphere is that purple shaded region. And then on the left, that red shaded region is what actually reaches the surface from the sun. You can see there's a ton of UV radiation we would expect, but we're not getting at the surface. And that's thanks to our ozone layer, which is a protective layer of the stratosphere that protects us from those harmful UV radiation. And so all the lines below it are different molecules, and those react at different wavelengths. And so what we see is that a ton of the radiation that's coming up from the surface of the planet is blocked by greenhouse gases of various types. Okay, next slide. So the basis of our theory behind the greenhouse gases is also the basis of technology that we use every day and take for granted. So it's not very controversial at all. In fact, we use satellites to look at the weather systems day and night. So during the day, we can just look down at the Earth and see the reflected sunlight, just like a regular camera. But at nighttime, we can also see the clouds, and we do that by looking at various wavelengths of infrared radiation that are allowed to be emitted through the atmosphere. And so the example on the right is the thunderstorm seen at night in the infrared band. That is a band that actually the atmosphere is transparent to, so it can come up from any level. So cloud top there. All right, next slide. So one question you might hear from your Uncle John at Thanksgiving is, okay, well, CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. How can it possibly even be a factor to create greenhouse effect? Well, as we said before, first of all, natural greenhouse gases keep the planet at a habitable 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And we also know that CO2 is important. So water vapor itself is very heterogeneous. We see it in moist climates like by the Gulf of Mexico, but up here in Colorado this time of year, there's nothing. But CO2 mixes incredibly throughout the depth of the atmosphere, up to 50 kilometers deep. And it's really hard for CO2 molecules to be taken out of the atmosphere. As we heard before about trees, the trees do that. But the average lifespan of a CO2 molecule in the atmosphere is over 100 years, versus a water vapor molecule, which is about 10 days before it's rained out or snowed out or whatever. So the other big problem here is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, CO2 was at 288 parts per million per volume. And today it's at about 420 parts per million. So that is a number that we'll look at a little more. And finally, water vapor, which I was talking about before, is, as we know from Florida, is a very effective greenhouse gas. And so as we heat the planet by introducing CO2 and other pollutants, it causes the atmosphere to get warmer. And a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, so there's actually a feedback loop. This also leads to other things, thus the term climate change. If we have more water vapor in the atmosphere, we're more likely to experience flooding rains and so forth. Okay, next slide. So here's some graphics that go from 1984 to almost now. And these show different greenhouse gases that are being measured at a site, I think Mauna Loa, which is a volcano, but it's not active at the moment. So it's been a very reliable record of the pristine atmosphere. And we can see that CO2 has just been marching upward, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down. Methane is also a very potent greenhouse gas. There was a period in the 90s and early 2000s that looked promising, but it's taken off again, unfortunately. All right, next slide. Looking back at reconstructed ice cores from Antarctica, we can go back 800,000 years in time. And so what the top graph shows is the record of CO2. And on the right, we have from the years 1000 AD to 2000. So you can see that the huge increase from 288 to 420 has been really over the last century or so. And you can see prior to 1,000 years ago, we have these ice age cycles whereas CO2 can get really low during the peak of an ice age, on above 300 in the ice core records. So definitely an unprecedented situation. Bottom panel's methane. All right, next slide. So this is going back to 1970. This is carbon emissions. So countries across the planet do a really good job of keeping track of how many greenhouse gases they burn. And what we see here is that, like the CO2, carbon emissions have increased as well. Towards the end, you can see this little dip in it. That's the global pandemic of 2020. And so, unfortunately, that was only a minuscule drop. But maybe you can start to see that in the early 2000s, it was really going up fast. Maybe it's kind of started to taper a little bit. So maybe just the first hints of some progress being seen here. The problem is we become more energy efficient. More countries around the world are increasing their emissions as well. All right, next slide. So how does this play out in terms of the climate? So first, we'll just take a look at a few of the important variables. So this is a graph of the global annual temperature. So this is just averaged over the entire planet. So what we see here is from 1960 to 2020, this really steep increase of about 1 degree Celsius. So that might not seem like a lot, but that's actually already produced a lot of significant change on the planet. It doesn't pack a punch as a global average. Climate change packs a punch in its anomalies, like, for example, the heat wave in Europe last summer. Okay, so next slide. And again, looking at a reconstructed ice core data all the way back to the time of Christ, we can see that the global temperature, according to ice core data, has only marched up significantly in the last century, corresponding to the Industrial Revolution. Climate skeptics online talk about this medieval warm period. You can see to the left, there is a lot of uncertainty in the measurement data, but even the upper ends of that don't even come close to the warming we've seen that occurs almost perfectly with our greenhouse gas emissions. All right, next slide. And unfortunately, we're seeing new records set this winter, even though we're breaking a cold temperature here in Colorado today. Right now, the global sea ice is at a record low since the beginning of the satellite era. So this does not contribute to sea level rise because this is sea ice, but if the sea ice is melting, we can also assume that Antarctica and Greenland are melting as well. All right, next slide. And in fact, if we look at sea levels since the early 90s, we see that there's been a steady increase of about 103 millimeters, which seems small, but when you add a storm surge from a hurricane on top of that, that makes a huge difference. Most of this sea rise so far has been due to thermal expansion, so just the oceans heating up. What we can expect in the future, as Greenland starts to melt and Antarctica starts to melt, is that we could see this rise even faster. Okay, next slide. And this is a longer term record of sea level rise using different data sets. And so going back to 1880, and this trend continues since then. And again, most of this is thermal expansion from the heating of the planet. All right, next slide. So I just was curious to look back, and this was educational for myself as well, to look at how long we've known about the greenhouse effect. And Joseph Fourier was a French mathematician, physicist that we studied in school for when we were doing Fourier series and everything, so engineers know this person very well. But I was just surprised to learn in 1824, this guy was a genius, so I'm not surprised, but he determined that the temperature of the Earth can be augmented by the interposition of the atmosphere. So basically, when you put heat through air, it could create heating. So he was the first to have kind of a hint that there might be a greenhouse effect. So this guy blows my mind. All right, next slide. This Eunice Newton-Foote, she was an amateur scientist, very brilliant. Today would be easily a well-known Nobel Prize physicist or scientist. But of course, she was working in the 1850s, so unfortunately, it was hard for her probably to pursue the career that she deserved. But she did some experiments at home and found that by putting certain air masses with greenhouse gases in them, that they could heat those air masses by subjecting it to radiation. And so she arguably is the first one to discover the greenhouse effect through laboratory work. Unfortunately, her work was presented at a conference, but then the person that presented it later discredited her work in an editorial at the New York Times, which is really unfortunate. All right, next slide. So John Tyndall, just a couple of years later, an Irish scientist, basically did similar experiments, a little more high tech, and found that it was actually the infrared radiation that could interact with some of these molecules like CO2 and H2O. So kind of reaffirming that the greenhouse effect is something we would expect. All right, next slide. So, and then Svante Arrhenius was a Swedish scientist, and he went as far to say that we could expect that our fossil fuel combustion that was already taking off in all our cities would probably lead to global warming. And in fact, he provided an estimate of like 5 degrees Celsius over the next century. His forecast wasn't terrible. He was on the right track, which is really impressive for his time. So since that time, we've made lots of advances in physics. We have quantum mechanics that allows us to understand the spectroscopy, sorry about that word, of molecules interacting with radiation, but so forth. So next slide. All right, so this is a really busy slide that just overviews our understanding of the entire Earth's radiation budget. So basically, I don't know if it's probably not worth dwelling on this slide, but what it shows is that the sunlight comes in, some of it reflects off, some of it is absorbed, but most of it goes into heating the planet. And then as the planet heats, it gives off mostly infrared radiation, but also gives off some sensible heat and water vapor. And the thing is that this has been in balance for a long time, but as we add more greenhouse gases, we see that this graph gets out of balance. And so when this graph was made back in 2009 by Kevin Trenberth, who's at NCAR, it was an imbalance of 0.6. 10 years later, we're at 1.0, so that's a huge increase, unfortunately. All right, next slide. All right, so observations, and I agree with this sentiment. This is a professor from UW-Madison, retired now, but a climate scientist. It says, one golden observation is worth 1,000 simulations. I agree with that, but let's take a look at some simulations now. So this is from the UN's International Panel on Climate Change. They do a report every few years on the state of the science, and basically they incorporate all the climate scientists across the planet in this huge cooperative effort. Really impressive how they do this. I mean, just having so many moving pieces. There's literally thousands of scientists that contribute to different chapters in this. So one of the big chapters is on climate models. And what they do is to have all these people from across the planet use their own high-tech climate model and run a simulation of the past up through today. How well do these climate models reproduce what we've seen in our climate is the question. And then from there, we can determine what caused changes that we see in the temperature. So we can turn on or turn off volcanoes. We can turn on or turn off the human contributions by emissions. And we can also look at things like sun activity. And so all those factors go into these climate models. In fact, I have a whole list of all the factors on the left. They're all based on what we know about physics. Well, what this really shows here is this is a ton of models. I can't remember the exact number, but what it shows is from 1850 through current times, all these different simulations of the Earth's temperature. And what you see in black, if you can squint your eyes on the top panel, is the observed temperature. So what you can see is all these climate models capture what has been observed pretty well. Really fascinating, like for example, we had the supervolcano Mount Pinatubo when I was young in the early 90s, and that actually caused this huge planetary cooling through the sulfates that were emitted into the stratosphere. And so the climate models were able to pick up that little cooling you can see there. So it's just pretty cool how you can see the models can reproduce this. All right, next slide. And so what we can do now that we know they can reproduce the climate pretty well is then turn different knobs. So we can turn on volcanoes, turn on human emissions, put on the cooling pollutants. So for example, when we emit our own sulfates from coal burning plants, that actually cools the atmosphere. And in fact, in the 70s, we had some global cooling from so much pollution from coal burning plants. So coal burning plants produce both carbon that heat the planet and also sulfates that cool the planet. And so what we see here is the sum of all these different factors. This line in the middle is 0. So on the left, we see this gray box, which shows the observed warming of about 1 degree Celsius. The next panel shows the net human influence. And then, so if we go to the right of that, that big box is greenhouse gases. And you can see if we didn't have other pollutants acting as a favor, our planet would probably be even warmer. But thankfully, we have other pollutants that are keeping us cool. That's the inspiration behind today's talk about geoengineering. I'm not sure if we'll talk about that this weekend, but natural forcings are just that little box that's centered around 0. So basically, when Uncle John at the Thanksgiving talks about volcanoes and sunspots, unfortunately, those aren't a factor in explaining the observed warming. Okay, sorry to pick on John. All right. So this is just looking at different forcings for different parts of the planet. And this is temperature through time. And so again, it shows if we were to have no human impact, it would be this green curve that goes flat. But once we add greenhouse gases, we see the curve that goes upward. So the climate, all these climate simulations are telling us, yeah, so we add more greenhouse gases as we'd expect, the planet warms. The big thing, though, that's a challenge for climate scientists, and they've spent a lot of time on this, is these models are very intricate. For example, a really interesting question is if we heat the planet, it will actually cause more evaporation of water from the oceans. So that creates more cloud systems and rain. So one concern back in the early days of climate modeling was the question, well, if we have increased clouds, would the planet get brighter and reflect more sunlight, so actually offset global warming? And so we've spent a lot of time investing in climate models to improve the representation of clouds and precipitation. And so far, to the best of our knowledge, we do not see any indication that there's a large negative feedback from clouds, unfortunately. So we won't have that working in our favor. Okay, next slide. Yes?
I've lived in Colorado since 1972, and I feel like it's gotten cloudier. I feel like when I was growing up, we were famous for 360 days of blue sky a year. I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like it doesn't feel like that anymore. It feels like
Could you stand up and talk so we can?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Trying to hit the highlights. I've lived here for 50 years in Colorado, and it seems to me like we have a lot more cloudy days. People are not going to hear this 3 times. Yeah.
Right, we have the handle. We're on.
I've lived in Colorado since 1972, and I've noticed many more cloudy days, especially like I feel like in the last 5 or 10 years. Is that real or not?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know how to answer that. I want to find out. That's something we can answer, and maybe someone knows. It's plausible that that could be a case. for a variety of reasons. First of all, if we have more moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, that could create more low stratus cloud days, which would be beneficial for Colorado. But we also have a lot of those days in November and in February when we have those mountain wave clouds that just cause kind of this overcast of high clouds. And so if the jet stream is changing position with time, that might change the clouds. But it's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. So yeah, there's a lot of fun topics like that to continue to study today, and it's, I love that question. All right, so this is just another graph showing before what we saw, that the combined effects of all these different forcings that we throw in the models are the best at reproducing what we see in observations. And so we have the greenhouse gases that would create even more heating than we see, but we have other aerosols produced by humans that offset that warming and keep us a little bit cooler. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of a heavy topic, so I wanted to maybe end on some positive things. And the question is, where do we go from here? So this shows, again, the CO2 emissions through time. We can see that, again, the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, wasn't the huge drop that we had hoped for, though it was a pretty significant blip anyway. But next slide. So what the IPCC does every report is they look at these different scenarios, because it's really hard to predict what humans are going to do 50 years from now. We hope they're going to take a ton of action, like UCC, and really go forward. So what they do is consider all these different scenarios, like SSP5 on the right is this drill baby drill solution, where we just use up all the fossil fuels and burn them as fast as we can. We also have scenarios to the middle where there's more kind of policies being put in place, but maybe unequally. And then finally, we get down to these really great solutions like SSP1, where we really do a great job of taking down carbon emissions. So we can put these in the models to kind of figure out where we're going to head. And let's see here on the next slide. So sorry, this is a kind of a busy, but on the far left is the CO2 emissions. The red line is the most extreme emission scenario, and the blue line is a really aggressive, cooperative solution where we really cut emissions. Then on the right, in the middle, we see the actual, what we would expect the CO2 concentration to do in the atmosphere. And you can see with increasing emissions, that would increase CO2. If we were to really push hard to reduce emissions, we can actually cause a peak by the late 2000s, and where it would actually start coming down again. And that makes a huge difference in what we see in the temperature. So if we don't do anything, the planet could warm 5 degrees Celsius, 7 degrees Celsius. We've only experienced 1 degree Celsius so far. If we push hard, though, we could limit the warming by less than another degree Celsius. And that's what the climate models show. So there are some promising solutions, but it's going to take a lot of work globally. Yeah.
Of course, most of this is over my head, but I wonder if the effects of global warming affects Earth rotation and, in effect, changes clearly our lifestyle and the way we live. And I'm not sure that a change in energy can correct what is now happening. And as I said, I'm not very knowledgeable with regards to this, so hopefully you can clarify.
Sure, thanks for the question. So I don't know how to answer the first part because I just don't know. But there is a lot of inertia. And unfortunately, this, like I said before, the CO2 molecule can stay in the atmosphere for 100 or so years. And right now, about 50% of the CO2 we're putting up in the atmosphere is thankfully being ingested by the planet. So our vegetation and our oceans have been doing us a huge favor. They've taken up about 50% of the emissions we've given off have been absorbed by the planet. If that hadn't happened, we'd be even twice as warm. But the question is, how long can these ecosystems do us that favor? If we warm the planet too much and start impacting ecosystems, will they turn on us and stop absorbing so much? Yes?
So first of all, thank you. But what you just brought up is something that has started to be an area of research for me, which is soil management. And so what I'm starting to understand from the research is that if we really started to do organic farming, regenerative agriculture, if in all of our urban development we did not use pesticides and herbicides, and we used, well, like in Colorado, there's some buckwheat, there's, this fescues and buckwheats that we could use here. Because what's happening is that we don't have a healthy microbiome. So we have dirt, we don't have soil. And what you just said about the earth being able to do that, but the way that our agriculture is going, the way that our urban development is going, we don't have a soil that has, I put some things out on the table, and we just had something in our church about that. So, if we really, unless, my understanding is that even if we stopped using fossil fuels on a lot of the conservation, things like that, we haven't actually started to pull the excess carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. And we use water, our soil isn't managing water, much less carbon. And if that were to is that in any of these models? Because we're working really hard in Colorado to try and bring this STAR program of the Colorado Department of Agriculture. I think the state of Illinois started it, but we don't have a widespread application of that. So I'd appreciate any information on that.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you very much for the question. I unfortunately have very little knowledge in this area. I don't think that's in the models, but I do think that's extremely important. So I think there's obviously a lot of smart people here that have a lot of knowledge about different topics that I don't have, so yes.
I'd like to make a comment about the previous comment. I subscribe to the school of thought that says commercial agriculture in the United States is a way of taking the calories in fossil fuels and making them edible. If we want to stop taking fossil fuels out of the ground, maybe we should stop going to King Soopers and grow our own food organically.
Yeah, food, the way it's used globally is very carbon intense. So, for example, we have products coming from all over the planet, and that not just for meat, but also vegetarian options too. So there's a lot of ways to move forward at the individual and community level. Sorry, I'm probably running out of time, so I'll advance quickly towards the end. These are different scenarios, we'll skip that. So this is just looking at where do we go? And this is a figure from the IPCC. And this shows what we need to do to keep the Earth at a certain temperature with carbon emissions. So you can see up through 2022, that curve is kind of plateaued, which is good. But if we want to keep the Earth at 2 degrees Celsius above its pre-industrial temperature, we would have to cut emissions to 0 by 2080. That's a pretty, yes? Oh, sorry. So that's a pretty intense goal. If we want to do 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would have to cut carbon to zero by 2040. Probably not as realistic. All right, next slide. So we do have some climate success stories, and thankfully set by the Paris Agreement as being a big one. And we've seen some countries do a really good job. For example, this plot here shows the UK and megatons of CO2 per year from just before the late 90s through 2020. You can see because the reduced use of coal and other efficiencies, the emissions have gone down. And they have, based on their current targets, this blue line that will come down, but they do believe now that they can get down to this lower X. And so they're on a really good trend there. Next slide. This is China, which has developed extremely rapidly, as we know, over the last few decades, and has done so by ramping up coal burning. But they're aware of the issue with that, not only in terms of CO2, but also just the air quality. And they are doing a lot to be greener. So we can see that based on their current trends, they're plateau, but longer term, they're still gonna have to do some major changes. And then the US, we're slowly seeing some coal plants come offline, and we do see cars getting more efficient, even though there's a lot of driving going on. So we can see that our carbon emissions have come down a little bit. So obviously we have a long ways to go is the message, but we can do some stuff, and we've seen some progress is the takeaway here. So the main takeaways is, sorry to get into the weeds, and a lot of you this might have been a review, but I wanted to point out how we have evidence that the Earth has a greenhouse effect and how that is causing the observed warming that we're seeing. And that indeed the human anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases can explain most of that warming. And so the biggest push that we'll need to get where we need to will be at the policy level. We need to have aggressive government incentives to push in the right direction in terms of using existing technology and improving technology in terms of scientific development. And that's about it. So I can take any more questions, and thank you for the great questions before.
Chris, thanks for this terrific presentation. I don't know if you'll have a response to this, but you might, because your background is more weather than climate, right?
Yes.
So my understanding is to think of something that everybody here can relate to. Every day we hear a weather report, right? And we hear whether or not today's weather is going to depart from normal, a little higher or a lot lower or whatever it is, right? And now, correct me if I'm wrong. Every 10 years, what we hear, we as normal people hear as normal temperature, is adjusted. Mm-hmm. And it's adjusted, again, correct me if I'm wrong, on a 30-year backward look. But it turns out the temperatures have been changing for roughly 100 years. Maybe it's 120 years that the temperature's been going up. And so every time we hear a weather report that tells us the departure from normal in terms of it's gonna be a really hot day, but it's only 3 degrees hotter than normal, it's actually more like 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And the weather reporters aren't the ones responsible for this. It's their, I don't know if it's an agency or their guild, which decides 30 years. Oh, that's a good measure of normal. 30 years is irrelevant when it comes to the changes that have been occurring to our planet. Could you just comment on that? I appreciate your nods, by the way, throughout that. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. I honestly don't know the exact reasoning behind that 30-year rule, but that is correct. And part of it could be just because in industry and agriculture, we might want to know only the last 30 years of normal, and then the departures from that, which cause us to shift our resources and plan at these shorter time scales. But in terms of climate change itself, that would be a horrible type of statistic to look at. An interesting point on that is, so today broke a record low, and people be like, see, that's no global warming. But what we actually see is that record highs are being broken far more often. We're also seeing record high-low temperatures. The nights are getting warmer. So if we were to start out with a brand new steady climate, we would expect to see record lows and record highs broken at about the same frequency over time. What we're seeing is these record lows are happening less and less often. So what today might be a record low of a -11, this anomaly maybe 100 years ago would have been a -13, for example, I don't know, just as a point of argument. So yeah.
You're talking about the weather people and stuff, and you work for them, kind of, you know, sort of atmospheric. One thing that's been really positive that I've noticed in the last couple of years is they talk about climate change. Now, that's a major thing, like on CBS News, you know, or someplace where the weather guy never used to mention that at all. Mm-hmm. And just all of a sudden, well, I'm glad, but, you know, I don't know if it makes a big difference, but it's kind of a cultural thing, I think, you know, that they now are saying, well, this is caused by climate change. Whereas like 10 years ago, they did not.
Yeah, thank you. I've noticed the same thing.
For me, it's Uncle Jim. And Uncle Jim says, you know, there are systems that the Earth has that always will return it to stasis. So those are just the Earth balancing itself out. So what should I tell Uncle Jim? And did you watch Look Up?
Yes.
I'm sure you get that all the time, right?
Yeah, so in terms of the equilibria, it is true the Earth has had equilibria from the beginning of its existence, and usually equilibria in any scientific phenomena are defined over a certain period of time, and they can change dramatically. I mean, the planet used to be tropical at the poles, and that was an equilibrated planet as well. We had a lot of greenhouse gases. The dinosaurs were roaming the Earth. We had palm tree, I don't know, about some kind of similar to a palm tree up in the Arctic. We see this in the fossil record. So equilibria can change, and that's a really interesting topic in itself. And as we add different forcing mechanisms and they're stationary, that will create different equilibrium. So yeah, that's really interesting though, because climate scientists have been interested in that question. For example, I brought up the example of clouds increasing with increased water vapor. Climate scientists back in maybe the 90s were hoping that we would find that the clouds would cool the planet as we warmed it with CO2, but unfortunately we found the clouds aren't going to do us that favor probably. Yeah, that was an interesting movie. Definitely intense. Sometimes it feels a little too close to home with this topic, eh? Yeah.
So that video we watched during the worship about the trees mentioned that I think there's been 6 extinctions, mass extinctions during the Earth's history. I'm just wondering how many of those were climate related, and if you know the answer to that.
I am sorry, I do not know the details of that. Some of them were climate related. For example, the loss of dinosaurs. If it was a comet, that would be a huge climate event of major cooling. But topic I don't know a lot about. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for that presentation. So we have a couple announcements. There's some light snacks in the hall if you're starving. If touring the UU Church at the workshop time, you can meet at the front door. And if you're returning to the church, Doug will be able to let you in. Stand up, Doug, so they know who you are. Okay, wave your hand, I don't care. Tomorrow we start at 9 o'clock in here. And then tomorrow late afternoon, if you noticed on your schedule, we will have a happy hour in Plymouth Hall before dinner. That's our little hour to get to know each other and have some conversation and just enjoy each other's company. Then we'll have dinner, and then we return to the sanctuary for a hot topics with our keynoters. So that should be unscripted. Doug will be running all around this sanctuary probably tomorrow, and we might have 2 mics for tomorrow. And if you by chance have not paid, you can give your check to anyone with the pink name tag, and we can take care of it for you. Does anybody have any questions before we break up? Okay, so UU Church tour is going to be at the front door at 4:15. Is that what time we're starting? Yeah, 4:15. And we have 1 class, 1 workshop upstairs in 212, right? Which is our La Forêt room. And then the Zoom, if you're in the Zoom, will be in this room right next to us, the Commons room. Okay? But be sure to ask anybody with pink name tags if you have any questions. Huh? Oh, yeah. So we also have a wonderful collection. Thank you for reminding me. Wonderful collection of children's books that are on loan that you are free to look through, as well as some books right here, out here in the narthex. So be sure to look at those too while you're here. So thank you for coming and enjoy your workshop.